The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. In 1820, Major Stephen H. Long described the Nebraska landscape as the Great American Desert, with wide open prairies and hardly any trees. Years later, efforts to change that landscape took hold thanks to key contributors to Nebraska's history. On this episode, we learn about those early efforts to encourage widespread tree cultivation in Nebraska in this 1972 Nebraska History magazine article, Trees But No Timber, a prelude to the Timber Culture Act by Burton J. Williams. Walter Prescott Webb, in describing the necessary adaptations for existence on the Great Plains, spoke of traditional prerequisites and used his analogy of a three-legged stool, i.e. land, water, and timber. On the plains, two of these legs, water and timber, were frequently in short supply, and thus the need for both innovation and adaptation. Webb's theme in The Great Plains was that American civilization and methods of pioneering were worked out east of the 98th meridian and were well suited to conditions there. However, when these institutions of the East undertook to cross into the Great Plains, they broke down and had to be modified. Putting his thoughts another way, 19th century Americans were dependent naturally on the obvious, the watered land. What has not been so obvious is the fact that their dependence upon wood was so great as to justify using an anthropological term, the Wood Age, to describe it. Admittedly, anyone would be hard-pressed to sell the Wood Age as a title to a Hollywood scriptwriter. 6 guns and saddle leather would doubtless be more acceptable to those seeking sensationalism in accounts of the Wild West. As the 19th century merged with the 20th, in spite of increasing use by manufacturers of metals and minerals as substitutes for wood, the consumption of forests did not diminish. Indeed, it increased. And forests remained a major source for fuel and housing construction materials. The history of tree planting in Nebraska and the exuberant promotional effort behind this endeavor are closely tied to these facts. The plains of Nebraska were essentially lacking in this predominant resource in 19th century America. One writer, ascending the Missouri River from St. Louis in 1854, observed that only the eastern tier of counties in Nebraska would ever be thickly settled and that the remainder would very likely be cultivated, quote, on account of scarcity of woodland and water, end quote. On June 17, 1854, the New York Herald published a report on the Great West and pointed out that the scarcity of timber was the greatest barrier to its settlement. Surveyors carefully chronicled the status of timber as the townships were laid out, with such remarks as, quote, the timber is chiefly of an inferior quality. There is not sufficient timber to supply the wants of farmers. There are a few scattered trees along the river and creeks fit only for fuel and fencing, end quote. The fact that at least some sort of timber was to be found along the banks of streams explains in part the early settlement patterns of territorial Nebraska. These settlement patterns have been traced and have been seen to advance westerly along the margins of rivers and streams. This indicates that the western march of migrants did not advance along a single frontier line, but instead penetrated along the arterial network of waterways. The limitations of such a migratory pattern soon became obvious, for only a fraction of territorial Nebraska could or would be settled if occupancy was largely confined along its waterways. In fact, in the eyes of at least one contemporary writer, Senator John J. Ingalls of Kansas, the wooded tracts next to water had been unattractive, even anathema to the energetic, industrious settlers. He claimed in his serio-comic essay, Catfish Aristocracy, that the most casual observer could not fail to notice the difference between the indolent settler who lived in the bottoms and the vigorous farmer who cultivated the upland prairies. The bottom dwellers he termed the catfish aristocrats who he felt contributed little to society while living indolently off the land, fishing, hunting, and cultivating half-heartedly small acreages. In his elaborate prose style, Ingalls scorned the catfish aristocrat who, he said, quote, builds no schoolhouse, erects no church. To his morals, the Sabbath is unknown. To his intellect, the alphabet is superfluous. He delights in cracklins and spare ribs, has a weakness for cowcumbers and watermelons. But when he soars above the crass needs of his common nature and strives to prepare a feast that shall rival the banquets of Lucullus, he spreads his festive cottonwood with catfish and pawpaws, end quote. Whether this kind of facetious geographic determinism had any credibility or not is questionable. If so, it only pertained to a very limited area along the deep rivers of eastern Kansas and Nebraska. There is some evidence to the contrary, i.e., that bottomland was coveted by the industrious settlers. Nevertheless, if extensive immigration were to be realized, then the upland prairies would, of necessity, be needed for the anticipated growth in population. To make these treeless, subhumid plains attractive to prospective settlers required something more than a good public relations program. Trees and water virtually everywhere were the essential requisites, and Nebraska's boomers planned to produce both. As early as 1857, the idea had been advanced that the federal government should inaugurate a program to encourage the growth of timber upon the western prairies. The specifics of this proposal suggested that the federal land policies should be amended so as to give a quarter section or sections of land to those who would agree to plant an unspecified number of acres with trees. However, such a proposal would wait some 16 years before Congress enacted such legislation. But Nebraskans proceeded on their own, and the gospel of trees and its attendant blessings were preached in the waste places of the territory. Acting Governor Algernon S. Paddock and his message to the legislature of January 11, 1867, favored a homestead law requiring every settler to cultivate 20 acres of timber on his homestead for 5 years as one of the conditions required to prove up his claim. 2 years later, the Nebraska legislature enacted a law whereby $100 worth of property would be exempted from taxation for every acre of forest trees planted and cultivated. The provisions of the law required the cultivation of such trees for 5 years, which was also the limit to the period of time to which the tax exemption applied. The trees were to be planted no farther than 12 feet apart and kept in a healthy growing condition. This law did not produce either ecstatic enthusiasm or cosmic convulsions. Seward County cited in a tract promoting the interests of that place by declaring, quote, with such laws as these, the vast prairies of the central state will, in a single generation, grow into a densely wooded country. And this one element of wealth, inducing immigration, will give it an additional impulse, and Nebraska will have a population that will have placed her in the front rank among the states of the nation, end quote. A Nebraska newspaper, however, indicated that such claims of grandeur were a long way from being realized, and in its reportage wondered why more people were not taking advantage of this act, since the economy of the state was so bad that it was impossible to even pay the interest on the present indebtedness. Two men who remained undaunted while associated with early tree planting efforts in Nebraska were Robert W. Furness and J. Sterling Morton. Furness came to Nebraska Territory from Ohio in 1856 and established the Nebraska Advertiser in Brownville. In 1867, he started a nursery business there and remained interested in agriculture and horticulture for the remainder of his life. He became the first president of the Nebraska State Board of Agriculture and later its secretary for nearly 20 years. J. Sterling Morton had arrived in Nebraska Territory in 1855 and made his home in Nebraska City. Like Furness, Morton also edited a newspaper, the Nebraska City News. He became active as a member of the Nebraska Board of Immigration and served for many years as an officer on the State Horticultural Society. In addition, he was extremely active politically, serving as acting governor and as secretary of the Nebraska Territory. He was a frustrated candidate for the governorship in 1866, 1882, and 1884, and was also unsuccessful in his bid for the U.S. Senate, suffering defeat in 1886, a year in which he also tried to be elected governor. He did, however, gain an appointment to the cabinet of the Grover Cleveland administration from 1893 to 1897, where he served with distinction. His major importance, insofar as the subject of this monograph is concerned, is the fact that he wrote the resolution designating the first Arbor Day and providing a prize for the person who planted the most trees on that day. The resolution itself urged Nebraskans to realize the importance of tree planting, and the State Board of Agriculture offered $100 to the County Agricultural Society, which properly planted the largest number of trees on that day. In addition, the state board offered a farm library worth $25 to the person planting the most trees on Arbor Day. The state's newspapers were urged to publicize the resolution and to remind the people of the importance of the matter from time to time. The individual winner that first Arbor Day was J.D. Smith, who lived 4 miles west of Lincoln. According to the Nebraska Herald, he planted 1 tree per second for nearly 10 hours, or 35,550 forest trees. The Herald reported also that Elder Taggart of Palmyra had planted 20,000 trees during Arbor Day week. The Nebraska Statesman declared J.D. Smith to be the first Arbor Day champion, claiming that altogether he had planted a total of 60 acres. Smith believed that within 10 years these trees would be worth $1 each. He estimated that he had planted altogether 136,000 trees and recommended tree planting as a paying business. The fact remains, however, that tree planting had been big business prior to such promotional efforts as Arbor Day. Robert W. Furness used his advertiser to promote both tree planting and his growing nursery business. On August 10, 1871, the advertiser contained a 2-column article under the title of The Effect of Trees on Climate. In it, Furness said that the concept of the Trans-Missouri as infertile was a myth, and that, in fact, this very region was God's domain, and that nowhere else was there richer or more productive soil. Its only deficiency was insufficient precipitation. The article went on to claim that Egypt's annual rainfall had already been increased from 6 inches to 24 as a direct result of planting trees. In Algiers, North Africa, similar miracles were supposedly transpiring. On the other hand, if the climate happened to be too wet and the ground marshy or swampy, again, the solution was to plant trees. The trees would drain the land and destroy the swamp fevers. From time to time, there were reports that large foreign investments were about to be made in an attempt to cover Nebraska with forests. However, this was never realized. The Omaha Daily Tribune was heartened at local efforts and the energy with which the settlers had commenced to plant trees, commenting that 4-inch seedlings could be purchased at West Point, Nebraska for $13.75 per thousand. The Tribune urged haste in planting, since the dearth of coal required an increasing supply of wood for fuel. The Tribune had been campaigning for tree planting for some time, having earlier declared, quote, "We can grow anything which can be successfully cultivated in Illinois or Ohio unless it be frogs," end quote. A few days later, a similar article concluded with this boast, quote, "Yes, Mr. Editor, in 5 years from today, the great American desert will be the Garden of America," end quote. Paradoxically, the Blue Valley Record printed a story in which the scarcity of trees appeared to be a boon. The story argued that it was easier for a farmer, quote, "to haul his wood and fencing several miles than to settle in a country where there is heavy timber and have to wear himself out clearing his land," end quote. The argument was pressed still further by the claim that if 2 farmers, one beginning his farm on the prairie and the other on timbered farm, were to compare their successes at the end of 10 years, the prairie farmer would have excelled by a wide margin the accomplishments of the farmer who began on timbered land. The prairie farmer, quote, will have double the amount of land under cultivation, will have fences equally as good, a better house, better stock. His land will be worth 25 to 50% more, and he will seem at least 5 years younger, end quote. The only reservation expressed in the record story about the advantages of prairie farming was the statement, quote, true, it may seem hard for a while, but after he once gets a start, he can live with half the labor and enjoy all the privileges he could on timbered farm, end quote. On May 31st, 1871, the State Journal carried the allegorical news story of a man who wanted to migrate from the east to Nebraska. He had no money. His only asset was a life insurance policy, and he had inquired of the newspaper what it might be worth. The Journal answered that the only way he could collect on the policy was to die, and in that event, he would not be able to go west. Following this prospective observation, the Journal went on to point out that loving parents would be wise to plant trees as a legacy for their children. The lesson drawn was that if the Easterner had had parents who were tree planters, he would have been wallowing in wealth with which to finance his move west. As for the kinds of trees to be planted in Nebraska, there was a profusion of advice concerning the most adaptable varieties. The European larch was frequently suggested, along with willow, cottonwood, ash, oak, walnut, hickory, chestnut, catalpa, maple, honey locust, black locust, Osage orange, and several varieties of pine. Sometimes there were conflicting reports about the successes obtained with one or more of these varieties. The qualities of the larch were hotly disputed, some claiming it grew well, others not at all. One critic argued in effect that it was unpatriotic to buy European trees such as the larch. He encouraged the planting of native trees until such times as farms were paid for. Then a few dollars could be squandered abroad. In spite of all the claims and the enthusiastic promotional activity, the annual report of the Nebraska State Horticultural Society in 1897 stated that, quote, not until 1873 did we see any active planting west of Lincoln, end quote. And this in spite of the fact that the planting of trees was alleged to cure the homesickness of immigrants, to cause rain, to moderate the temperature, to prove parental love of their children, to instill patriotism, and of course, tree planting was guaranteed to make everybody rich. Yet, surprisingly, the 1880 Nebraska Agricultural Census lists woodland and forest as unimproved. The fact that the attempt to promote tree planting was not an unqualified success is attested to by a correspondent of the New York Sun. While traveling over the plains of Nebraska, he sent his paper a deprecatory news story, appending to it what he termed, quote, the only real picture of a western prairie ever taken. It was taken on the spot. It is a night scene, as seen by night, end quote. What accompanied his article in the Sun was a small, column-wide, all but blank rectangle containing only the numbers 1 through 11 and a total of 19 asterisks. Below this, the numbers were identified as 1. Prairie chicken, 2. A herd of cattle, 3. Unheard of cattle, 4. Boston drummer, 5. Silvery sheen, 6. Space, 7. Nothing, 8. Pale moonbeams, 9. Do, 10. Don't, 11. Dust. Following the picture was this explanation, quote, all the blank part is grass. The stars are supposed to be shining on the grass, and all nature is hushed. That part of nature that is not hushed is left out of the design by design, end quote. One loyal Nebraska newsman's editorial comment was simply that the Sun correspondent, quote, did not appreciate the picturesque beauty of our western landscape, end quote. Nevertheless, out of all of this came a federal supplemental land law, the Timber Culture Act, which was approved March 3, 1873. Its provisions were ludicrous. Its author, Nebraska Senator Phineas W. Hitchcock, should have known as much, being familiar with the state's varying rainfall and temperature patterns, its soil capabilities, and the time and energy the harassed homesteader had to devote to caring for his plots of trees. Yet somehow, once the act was sanctioned in Washington, local conditions, including climate and geographic determinants, were supposed to cooperate. But in Nebraska, they didn't. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.